This game truly is the pits. It's episode 64 of NES Works. After a couple of genuine 1987 NES greats, we find the universe striving for balance with a game that is the opposite of great. Now, a certain variety of NES fan loves to go on about how some game or another is the worst NES game of all time. This is very silly because Nintendo licensed more than 700 games for the NES over its lifetime, and quite a few of those were absolutely dreadful. There is no one single worst ever game for the NES. But there were some very, very bad NES games. And Super Pitfall ranks right down there among the most miserable, most hateful, most unplayable, most unenjoyable hunks of trash ever published for the system. This is one of those rare games that video game nerds are correct, rather than needlessly hyperbolic, to be angry about. Super Pitfall is a mess made all the more frustrating by the existence of a closely related game that shows how this game concept can be done well. Super Pitfall comes to us from a cursed combination of creative forces. First, there's Activision, who had fallen into the doldrums that led to their brief and best forgotten rebranding as Mediagenic. Activision had, so far as I can tell, no direct creative input into this game, but they did sign off on it, and apparently at no point did they say, hey, Pitfall's sole creator David Crane should be involved in this project. So they're every bit as much to blame for this disaster as their co-conspirators, Pony Canyon and Micronics. Ah yes, Micronics. After the perfectly lukewarm TIGER-HELI and a profoundly tolerable port of elevator action, Micronics is back to its miserable tricks. Or should that be his miserable tricks, if indeed the rumors of Micronics being a one-man shop are correct? In any case, Super Pitfall feels like Micronics took a long, hard look at their god-awful work for SNK with Athena and Akari Warriors and sneered, right, we can do so much worse. And they did. Super Pitfall is sort of a new and never previously seen game, but at the same time it also seems to be based pretty directly on Pitfall 2 for Atari 2600, which we saw recently in Metroidvania Works. However, despite its omnipresence on worst NES games ever lists stretching back at least all the way to Sean Baby's landmark creation in the 90s, and rightly so, there's actually not a whole lot of information about the real origins of this disaster online. From what I can tell, Super Pitfall appeared on both the Tandy Color Computer and the NEC PC-8801 in addition to the NES. The NES and PC-88 versions shipped a mere 2 months apart in Japan, both published by Pony Canyon, which suggests they were developed concurrently, but by independent teams. While I haven't played the PC-88 version for myself, it appears to be a far more capably crafted game. The visuals look a lot nicer there than on NES, the frame rate doesn't seem to suffer from that Micronics good enough drive for mediocrity, and the play physics and controls at least appear to be more responsive. This helps lend credence to the popular online theory that Super Pitfall began life as a conversion of Pitfall 2. After Hudson had hit it big by bringing hot American computer hit Lode Runner to Japan on PC and Famicom, several other developers began snatching up big games from the US as well. For example, Sega did great things with their arcade conversions of CHOPLIFTER and Pitfall 2, which hit arcades in 1985. Around the same time, Pony Canyon looks to have snagged the home rights to Pitfall 2, which they converted to MSX home computers and shipped just as Sega's arcade rendition arrived. The MSX release looked obsolete upon arrival, faithfully carrying over the 2600's original stick figure graphics and simple blocky environments. Because you see, Sega's conversion had a vibrant cartoon style and significantly reworked the game world's layout and the gameplay. Sega integrated new game mechanics to make Pitfall 2 feel more like the original Pitfall, with vines to swing on, rolling logs to leap, and crocodile heads to skip over. Rather than beginning the adventure directly above an inaccessible cavern where beloved family pet Quick Claw was trapped, Pitfall Harry began above a tunnel he could reach directly. In fact, Sega's Pitfall 2 appears initially to be an overhaul of the original game, rather than a port of Crane's sequel. You have to advance a couple dozen screens into the game before the level design opens up to be anything more adventurous than a parallel, two-tier land tunnel design. It's only once you reach a statue and a key at the end of the land sequence that you begin to descend underground. And even then, the exploration element is greatly downgraded from the 2600, although the overall structure of the world reflects Crane's design. Which brings us to Super Pitfall, published by Pony Canyon a year after their faithful MSX port and Sega's bold reimagining for arcades. Super Pitfall more or less splits the difference, reworking the beats of Pitfall 2 with the opposite emphasis of Sega's linear coin-op game, effectively resulting in a brand new, sprawling underground adventure. You can especially see the Sega influence in the PC-88 version, which uses a graphical style similar to the arcade games. On NES, however, Pitfall Harry looks completely different, with a mustache and a posture that seem familiar somehow. Who knows? Anyway, I don't suppose you can fault Pony Canyon's instincts here for trying to modernize their take on the Pitfall license. By autumn of 1986, when the game shipped in Japan, expectations for action games had changed radically since Pitfall 2 made its 1984 debut on Atari. 2 years had given us upheavals like Wonder Boy, Ghosts and Goblins, Metroid, and, that one guy with a mustache. Video games and genres evolve more slowly these days than they did in the 80s, so it's hard to express just how greatly the platformer had changed in the brief time between Pitfall 2 and Super Pitfall. Pony Canyon's instincts to reinvent Pitfall 2 for NES were right. Their instinct to trust Micronics to get it correct were less defensible. Super Pitfall has all the elements it needs to be a memorable entry in the pantheon of 1987's proto-Metroidvania works. It has exploration, traps, action, a guy with a mustache, and more. But instead, it ended up being a colossal failure, just an epic disaster on every conceivable level. First, there's the obvious matter of how poorly it plays. Much as we saw with ATHENA, Super Pitfall's protagonist moves in a sputtery, awkward sort of way, as does the world around him. His control physics feel simplistic, even compared to Pitfall Harry on 2600. And his collision detection with enemies is extremely loose and inconsistent, even compared to Pitfall Harry on 2600. Micronics redesigned Harry to look like Mario, but they didn't bother to take any cues from the refined controls and physics that helped elevate Super Mario Bros. To become a masterpiece. This controls like an early black box NES game, which is very unfortunate because we saw the last of the games with black box trade dress a few episodes ago. Not only has NES software moved well beyond that era of design, even its packaging has too. Despite Pitfall Harry moving poorly here and being susceptible to dying at the hand of enemies that the controls and collision programming make difficult to judge and avoid, there's nevertheless an expectation of flawless play over an extended period of time. Rather than treating death as an inconvenience the way Pitfall 2 did, or bumping into an enemy sent Harry back to a checkpoint while docking points from his score, here it's just a 3 strikes and you're out for good affair. On the plus side, Super Pitfall does behave a bit like Spelunker, which was presumably another point of influence, in that Harry reincarnates in the vicinity of where he dies. But after 3 deaths, that's the game. Yet Super Pitfall is much more unforgiving than Spelunker. Well, maybe unforgiving is the wrong word. Unlike in Spelunker, you don't die if you fall from a height of more than 8 pixels. Pitfall Harry can plummet from great heights and end up no worse for the wear. So maybe it's more that Super Pitfall is less fair. The screen proportions mean you can never really get a proper sense of the world around you, and the free-scrolling, all-directional design of the stages, which is admittedly impressive for a 1986 game, forces you to take many blind leaps. You can drop into a cavern from the very starting point to retrieve a treasure if you like, but chances are you'll die immediately from landing on a bat that can't be seen before you take the plunge. This sort of gotcha design permeates Super Pitfall. It's not enough that simply evading enemies is a Herculean challenge, you frequently have no idea that enemies are even inbound until it's too late. And even this might be tolerable in time if the fundamental design of Super Pitfall weren't so incredibly obtuse. Unfortunately, the basic exploratory and treasure hunting mechanics here are a massive step backward from the forward-thinking format of Pitfall 2. Pitfall 2 took place in a large, open-ended, low-stress subterranean world. It wasn't a complete cakewalk by any means, but the challenge stemmed from learning to navigate its spaces, then learning to do so again while maximizing your score and avoiding penalties. Basically, it was a quest for a perfect game. Super Pitfall is about blind guesswork and performing counterintuitive actions in order to make any progress at all. The vast majority of critical items and treasures in Super Pitfall are hidden invisibly and require Harry to jump at key spots. These locations aren't telegraphed or marked in any way, so you just have to blunder into them. Admittedly, Super Pitfall wasn't the only game to employ invisible objects to pad out playtime in this era, but it's definitely among the worst of them. And that's saying something because Deadly Towers did a whole lot of this. But then again, so did Konami's original The Goonies, and that game holds up reasonably well. The difference between The Goonies and Super Pitfall is that the key elements you needed to collect in The Goonies, the eponymous kidnapped children, were always hidden in plain sight, behind clearly visible vault doors. The invisible hidden stuff was just there to give you more points, or to beef up the hero's capacity for survival. By the time the Goonies sequel arrived in the US as a contemporary of Super Pitfall, it had almost entirely relegated the hidden elements to their own gameplay mode, quarantining the hunt and search mechanics away from the main action. But here it's all one big, disgusting blob of unhappiness. As in Pitfall 2, you're out to rescue Quick Claw and Harry's niece, Rhonda. But here you need to find keys and explore separate zones, including the hellish Dark World, in order to succeed. And all the critical items for advancement are, again, invisible, hidden, inaccessible except through luck or a strategy guide. And then there's the most infamously egregious design choice in the entirety of Super Pitfall, the part where in order to find Quick Claw, you have to jump into a seemingly random vulture. You know, the same birds that everywhere else in the game will kill Harry and deplete one of his 3 precious lives on contact. Evidently, players are supposed to notice that one of the birds flies at a slightly different altitude than the others, and from that minor detail, experience the revelation that seemingly committing suicide will help you complete the game. That's some fine intuitive design work there. And to top it off, the game feels like it's about to fall apart on a technical level at any moment. Besides the wretched collision detection, it also suffers from grating issues like Harry's tendency to random slip and fall from ladders at the worst times, but to cling onto them or refuse to exit his climbing animation when you really need him to react quickly. Meanwhile, there are multiple parts where you're meant to maintain the Pitfall tradition by swinging from vine to vine, but getting Harry to hold onto a vine is an exercise in madness. I don't know, this game isn't good by any stretch of the imagination, and yet you almost can get a sense of the big ideas its designers had in mind, especially once you reach the bizarre Dark World. I could see that with an invincibility and infinite lives code, it could almost be interesting, but there's something going on under the surface here that you almost want to admire. Almost. All the good intentions in the world count for nothing when they're buried in a game that fails so profoundly on every meaningful design and technical front. Super Pitfall might have been excusable, even laudable, had it arrived at the NES's launch. But shipping amidst the many excellent exploratory platformers we've seen on NES in 1987, not to mention a few linear greats like Castlevania, there's just no way to justify the severity of this train wreck. Super Pitfall still managed to sell pretty well on NES thanks to its name cachet. Pitfall had been a big hit on Atari, and here was the next generation version. Imagine the disappointment players must have felt to experience a game vastly larger, but also infinitely worse than what they had expected. In fact, the game did so well that Activision had plans for a Super Pitfall 2, which, as it turns out, would have been a localized version of Sunsoft's Atlantis no NAZO, an infamously punishing and obtuse game that actually does feel like spiritual kin to Super Pitfall, but is honestly much better. To be honest though, despite its reputation for being hateful, I'd much rather we have just gotten Atlantis no NAZO as Super Pitfall, in place of this Micronics developed offense. But I suppose there's value even to this misbegotten release. It's a good reminder that even though the leading edge of NES design is moving forward and doing much to help define the future of video games, there's still plenty of trash to be contended with. In fact, I'm afraid there's quite a bit more mediocrity that needs to be dealt with before we get to the impressive 1-2 punch that ends NES Works 1987. But the good news is that none of it will be anywhere near as bad as Super Pitfall, which absolutely defiles the legacy of one of the great 8-bit American franchises. Next time, Hudson and Tecmo plant the unassuming seeds for what would become a great video gaming legacy.